Why, hello there, creeps, and welcome to another episode of Madams and Murderers. I'm your host, Malia Molino, happy to properly disturb, disgust, and entertain you. Considering our namesake, I am obviously rather engrossed with both Madams and Murderers. But folks, never until now have I done an episode who can fulfill both of those titles. Okay, in reality, she wasn't a madam, just a prostitute, but you get what I'm going for. Today's tale is going to be quite the journey, from innocent philandering to some nasty-ass backwoods shit to a truly horrific execution. And I mean graphic. Melting eyeballs, people. Melting eyeballs. So to put it frank, buckle up, because Madams and Murderers is about to get gross. Ladies and gents, it's time to tell the tale of Catherine Hayes. Our story starts in Birmingham, home to one of my favorite historical gangs, the Peaky Blinders, and only mostly because I have an obsession with Cillian Murphy. The year is 1690. It's not a great year if you happen to be a Jacobite, but this story isn't about Jacobites. It's about a poor man named Hall who happens to have a daughter who he names Catherine. The mom? No idea. Can't find a single word written about her. Catherine's story really grows legs when she turns 15 and decides to run away from home. Here's the thing. Catherine is nothing short of confident. The kind of confidence that just wasn't common for an 18th century peasant. And she's thinking, you know what? I'm young. I'm pretty enough. I got curves like these unlit murder streets. Let's just sell this hunk of flesh to the right bidder. And oh boy, does she find it. A whole damn house full of army officers at the Great Ombersley. What I find most amusing about this is she seems to enjoy servicing these servicemen more than they enjoy it. Like they tire of her pretty quickly, but she's just loving the variety of trouser snake. Since the men were tiring of her, she couldn't make her entire living off of prostitution, so she also takes up work as a domestic servant. I'm just wondering what level of nympho you have to be that a whole house of army officers are tired of having sex with you. But I digress. While she's balancing the two, she takes up relations with a local tanner. It's unclear if they were romantically involved or if he was just another customer, but at some point we do know she gets pregnant and ends up giving birth to a son who she will give up for adoption. 8 years after running away from home, she finds a permanent position as a domestic servant in the home of a local farmer named Mr. Hayes, who, lucky for her, had 2 sons. His eldest son was named John, and at 21 years old, the 23-year-old Catherine seemed worldly, alluring, and he fell for her. Hard. They married in secret in 1713. I'm not entirely sure why it was a secret, but I'm assuming it's because John assumed his father wouldn't approve of his son marrying the help. Or perhaps the rumors of his now wife's hobbies may have made it to his ears, and he didn't have the strength to explain to everyone who questioned his choice that they were in love. Well, at least he was. As we've already discussed, Catherine liked dick, a lot of it, and one was just not enough for her, but she would try. For a while. Well, 6 months. After that, Catherine would start taking on lovers. She also may have been bored, to be fair. John was out working all day, and when he got home, he was often too tired for sex, so what's a girl to do? On top of the inadequate amount of coitus John was throwing down, Catherine was sick of being in the country and would consistently nag John to move them to London. I don't blame her. London is awesome. Even during this time, minus the sewage issue and murders and all of that, it was a great place. 6 years of living on his father's farm in a humble cottage finally caught up with them, and John finally acquiesced Catherine and moved them to London in 1719, where he opened up a business where he was a pawnbroker, coal merchant, and moneylender, and this made him money. I mean, enough money to afford servants. You have to imagine this was an exciting time for Catherine, because she herself was once a servant. Talk about a Cinderella story. Except our little Cinder girl is ungrateful, and this life, although a vast improvement on every second of her existence up until now, was not enough. She wanted more. Never mind the fact that she was getting a hefty allowance and taking on lovers. Truthfully, she was living the sugar baby dream. But her nagging came with a cost because after all he'd done for her, John was getting sick of her shit and was like, "You know what, honey? You've complained too much, so I'm docking your allowance." And as a spoiled brat she was, she threw a complete tantrum, thus starting the ongoing trend of their tireless arguing. Somehow, some way, she convinced John to take in boarders in 1725. There are a couple reasons why this was a common occurrence during this era, usually because it meant more money, you could charge rent to your boarders, and when you have a greedy wife like Catherine, you probably need all the money you can get. However, in this case, the reasons were much more sinister. Buckle up, folks. Catherine convinced John to take in two Thomases, Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood, both of whom she would start sleeping with nearly immediately. Thomas Billings, however, just happened to be her illegitimate son, and she knew it. To clarify, just so we're all on the same page, Catherine was having a sexual, incestuous relationship with her own fucking son with her knowing consent. Yeah, it's gross, but I promise you it's not the grossest part of our story. At some point in February of 1726, Catherine officially makes up her mind that John is more used to her dead than alive. It really boiled down to the fact that she didn't love him anymore. He didn't spoil her enough. He wasn't enough sexually. I mean, really, what good was he at her to this point? Instead of doing the decent thing, which was just leave with one or both of her lovers, which, again, one of them being her son, and leaving John to probably have a way better fucking life without her, she decides John has to die, and the two Toms were going to help her. Just as an aside, I have no idea if Billings knew she was his mother, and I can't find any reason as to why or how she convinced the two men to carry out her fatal plans, but I'm assuming, and again, there's no way to know, but I'm assuming there was talk of money and maybe her sex was just that good. Lord knows she had practice. So here's how it went down. It was March 1st, and the two men took John out for a night of drinking. How John had no idea the two men were porking his wife? No clue. Did he know Billings was Catherine's son? No clue. Was John an idiot? Maybe. But let's not victim shame. They decide to play a harmless little bar game called Who Can Drink the Most Without Dying, clearly planned to get John shit-faced, which he does. They take his drunken ass home, plop him in the bed, and then proceed to kill him, quite brutally. The hope was that John was so drunk, so incapacitated, that he wouldn't even know what was happening to him. But when Billings took an axe and hit him in the head, John woke up and he fucking screamed. At this point, Thomas Wood steps in, who happened to be a butcher by trade, and helps Billings out and successfully kills John with an axe. Unfortunately, a neighbor had heard the screaming and came next door to see what was the matter. As Catherine is downstairs telling her neighbor that they are having a party, the two Toms were upstairs, decapitating her husband and meticulously dismembering him as to eventually scatter his remains and make his identification more difficult. That same night, they would toss John's head into the Thames at Millbank, and I gotta say, they didn't succeed in making it very inconspicuous. They wrapped the head in a cloth and put it in a bucket. Buckets fucking float. Why put the head in a bucket? The rest of the body was scattered in a nearby pond. John's head would wash up on a sandbank near Westminster, and as with custom of the day, when one found a random head, the head was displayed on a spike in St. Margaret's churchyard in a hopeful attempt to have someone identify it. Also, let's just marinate in the fact that this was something you would have just gotten used to seeing in London at the time. If a head washes up, well, it needs to be identified, so let's just put the thing on a spike. I just can't imagine a reality where on my way to work, like to go clean chamber pots or something, I might be passing a row of decapitated heads. That would just be normal. But anywho, three different dandies, I don't know if they were dandies, but it's a nice thought, identify the head as John Hayes. Bingo! They're correct. One of them is a dude named Mr. Ashby, who happened to be a work pal of John's. He was like, holy shit, that's my friend, and I need to talk to his wife, and so he goes to see Catherine, who says it couldn't be John because John was away on business. Mr. Ashby does not buy the lie, especially since he had plans to meet with John and he never showed because, duh, he was dead. So he thought, fuck it, I'm going to the police, and then he returns with the Popos, who clearly want answers. But when they get there, they find Catherine, in bed with her son. Cue the orchestra, folks. The jig is up. Catherine, Thomas Billings, and the neighbor who'd heard the yelling were all arrested that day. Thomas Wood had fled London, but eventually was caught. The neighbor would later be released because the poor woman literally had nothing to do with the murder. On April 16th, a formal inquest was made for the investigation of John's murder. As with the Times, the newspapers took up this story immediately, and it was a hot ticket, mainly because it was one of the first crimes in London where a decapitated head had happened. Pretty spicy. Because of this, though, the public already believed the three to have murdered John. They did, but no trial had happened yet. Before the trial took place, the constable decided to carry out what one could only compare to a modern-ish version of a witch test. They had since recovered John's head from the spike and put it safely in a jar full of gin as to preserve it, casual, and presented the jar with the head to Catherine and told her to touch it. Why did they want her to touch the head? Well, it was believed in the day that if a murderer was to touch the head of their victim, their guilt would be pulled from them and unable to hide, hence confirming their involvement and crime. You know, science. Catherine, being the smartass she was, knew this trick and happily touched his head, and instead of confessing her sins, pretended to be overcome with grief. The experiment had failed. Shocker, but thankfully the constable wasn't believing it and sent her to Newgate to await trial. Now at this point, both Catherine and Billings are maintaining an innocent plea. However, once Thomas Wood was caught, he sung like a canary, which means A, he definitely wasn't Italian, but also he was trying to save his neck, which I can't blame him for. He puts all of the blame on Catherine and Billings, claiming his only involvement was the dismembering and not of any of the fatal blows. It is at this point that Catherine says, "Yes, I planned this, but the devil was in all of us and made us do it." Bitch, this isn't a Conjuring movie. Get a better plea. So now all three of them are awaiting trial at Newgate Prison. Not a place you want to be. What's really interesting about this period in London is you don't have trials on any given day. You had sessions where all of the cases for various crimes would be proceeded over in a series of days, mainly because some of the judges and jury members didn't live in London proper and had to come into town for trials. Our three amigos were tried in the sessions that took place between April 20th and 23rd. The same sessions our victims from last week's episode about the Molly houses were tried. All three of the trials were pretty cut and dry. They'd committed the murder, for that there was no doubt, but the severity and charges the three were brought up on would differ. The two Toms were both handed a guilty murder charge. The punishment would be death by hanging, and after they were hung by the neck until dead, their bodies would be gibbeted, or put in chains. Essentially, their corpses would be hung from a wooden pole in a metal cage until their carcasses had either decayed or had been devoured by birds. It was an awful sentence. True, they wouldn't be alive for that part, but this had more to do with humiliation and making a statement than anything. It was the gibbeting the two men protested. Oddly, not the death sentence. The sentence would be quite different for dear old Catherine, though. Creeps, it's time we shine a little light on a really fucked up part of the legal system at this time. So murder, it's bad, right? Like you can't commit something worse than murder. Wrong. You actually can if you commit petty treason. You might be thinking of treason as like William Wallace, right? Well, you can commit treason against other things besides your king, like your owner or master, of which a husband was considered. That means, according to English law in 1726, that Catherine Hayes was owned by John, and when she plotted and carried out his murder, even if not by her hand, she'd committed the fatal crime of petty treason, which carried with it a sentence I probably wouldn't wish on my worst enemies. First, you would be dragged by a carriage all the way to your execution site. Then, you would be tied to a wooden pillar with chains in the center of a pyre and a cord tied around your neck that would be fed through a hole with it coming out the other side, where the executioner could pull on it at will. The pyre would then be lit, and you would die slowly. This would be the fate of Catherine Hayes, except her death would go horribly, horribly wrong. Like the two Toms, she accepted that she would pay for her crime with her life, but fought until the end to have her sentencing changed as to avoid the pyre. Her requests were denied. Lucky enough for Thomas Wood, if you want to call it that, he would never end up actually getting gibbeted because he would die awaiting his execution in jail from jail fever. May 9th, 1726, Thomas Billings and Catherine Hayes, along with 6 other men, made their way to Tyburn Prison for the mass execution. Thomas Billings would have rode on a cart sitting atop of his coffin, and Catherine, not needing a coffin, would have been tied to a fence-like thing and dragged the entire way. The executions would take place in the press yard at Tyburn Prison, which means it was public, and you better believe there was a crowd. From the fence in which she was chained, Catherine watched as all 6 men were hung, including Thomas Billings, who again was her son. There's a real macabre full circle moment here, seeing as though she literally brought him into this world and because of her actions, made him leave. After the men were sufficiently dead, the dessert of the execution, so to speak, was ready. It was time for Catherine to meet her maker. As she was being chained to the stake in the middle of the pyre, she begged the executioner to strangle her before the flames met her body. However, by the time he started to pull, the cord had gotten so hot that it burned his hands and he let go, and the flames made their way up to Catherine's shrieking, terrified body. The sight was becoming so gruesome and hard to watch as the flames literally ate at her flesh that onlookers were screaming out for someone to do something, anything to take away the pain. It was at this point that the executioner picked up a piece of wood and threw it as hard as he could at Catherine's head, which both killed her and sent a river of her brains flowing out. That was only to be surpassed in grossness when her eyeballs started to melt. Yes, there is a written testimony of her eyeballs melting. The sight so many came to see was a straight-up horror show, but let's be honest, the people loved it. No one came to an execution with a weak stomach. It was their morbid curiosity that led them there. They wanted to see brains, and they got what they came there for. It is said it took a whole hour for Catherine's body to finally burn down into ashes. She would have been just 36 years old. What strikes me about the case of Catherine Hayes and her subsequent execution is just how barbaric human beings can be. When she no longer wanted to be with her husband, she didn't think twice before conducting a murder that had him literally hacked to death. When the murder was written about in the papers and throngs of people gathered at the press yard to watch her gruesome execution, people were excited. They were excited to watch the murder of a murderer. And to me, it begs the question, does murder by law make it any less barbaric? If we are to hope for the death penalty of a person who we deem to be worthy of execution, how and where does the line form between us and them? Thank you guys so much for listening to today's tale. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a second to rate, review, and subscribe. It makes a huge difference. If you want more macabre content, head over to my YouTube channel where I have literal hundreds of videos on the subject. Link, as always, is in the show notes. Until next week, ching ching creeps.